lonely CEO stopped to help a struggling single dad in a pharmacy when no one else did. Just a small act of kindness, nothing more. What she didn't know, he had once done the same for her, years ago, when she had nothing. And the universe had been quietly keeping score ever since. The meeting had gone well. That was the problem. When things went well for Natalie Harper, she felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just the hollow echo of another box checked. She had just walked out of a 40-floor glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, where 3 investors had agreed to fund her company's next round at a valuation that would have made her 22-year-old self weep. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk at 9:47 p.m., her umbrella inside out from the wind, rain soaking through her blazer, and thought, "Is this it?" She was 36 years old, CEO of Harper Solutions, a tech firm she had built from a rented desk and a borrowed laptop. Forbes had called her quietly ruthless. She preferred efficient. She had no husband, no pets, and a penthouse apartment she mostly used for sleeping. She ducked into the nearest pharmacy, a small, buzzing fluorescent place on the corner of Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. Not because she needed anything, but because she was cold and her driver was 11 minutes away. That's when she saw him. He was standing at the counter near the back, tall, lean, wearing a damp jacket that had seen better winters. One arm cradled an infant in a pale yellow onesie. The baby was sleeping, tiny fist pressed against her cheek, completely unbothered by the world. With his free hand, the man slid a can of baby formula across the counter toward the cashier. "I just need to return it," he said. His voice was low, steady, not angry, just tired in the way that runs deeper than sleep can fix. "It's unopened. I have the receipt." The cashier, a teenager with headphones around her neck, barely looked up. "Sir, I already told you, store policy, no returns on baby products." "It's sealed," he said. "Policy's policy." A pause. The man looked down at the can, then at his daughter, then back at the cashier. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once, the kind of nod that says, "I understand, and I'm choosing not to make this worse," and slid the formula back into a plastic bag. Natalie stood in the cold medicine aisle, pretending to read the back of a Dayquil box. She told herself it wasn't her business. People had hard moments every day in this city. You could break your heart on every corner if you let yourself look long enough. She kept watching. He turned to leave, and that's when the baby shifted. A tiny, sleepy sound, barely a whisper, and the man immediately pulled her closer, his whole body adjusting instinctively, protectively, like it was the most automatic thing in the world. He pressed a brief kiss to the top of her head. Something in Natalie's chest moved. She put the Dayquil down. She walked to the formula aisle, grabbed the same brand, the one he'd been trying to return, and took it to the register. She paid without hesitating. Outside, the rain had thickened into something serious, the kind that fogs the streetlights and makes the whole city look like an old photograph. He was still there, standing at the edge of the pharmacy awning, adjusting his daughter against his shoulder with one arm while trying to open his bag with the other. He wasn't calling a cab. He was looking at the subway entrance across the street. Natalie walked up beside him. "Excuse me." He turned. Up close, his face surprised her. Younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with dark circles and sharp eyes that were, despite everything, alert. Cautious, but not closed. "I think I accidentally grabbed 2 of these," she said, holding out the formula. She hadn't rehearsed the lie. It fell out of her mouth like it had been waiting. "I don't have a baby at home, so—" He looked at the can, then at her. He wasn't fooled. She could see that immediately. But he looked down at his daughter, still sleeping against his chest, and something in his expression shifted. The pride stepping aside just long enough for the father to make the call instead. "Thank you," he said quietly. He took it.
They stood there for a moment, rain hammering the awning above them. "She's beautiful," Natalie said, nodding at the baby. She surprised herself. She wasn't the type to say things like that to strangers. "She is," he said.
And the way he said it, simply, completely, without even a trace of performance, made Natalie feel oddly ashamed of her own evening, of the investors, the valuation, the hollow success. "Ethan," he said, shifting the baby to offer a brief handshake. "Natalie." He nodded, looked out at the rain. "I should get her home before she wakes up cold." He glanced at her once more, a look she couldn't quite read, and then walked across the street toward the subway entrance and disappeared down the steps. Natalie stood under the awning for a moment longer. Her driver texted, "Here." She didn't move right away, because something about that man's face, the quiet dignity of it, the shape of his exhaustion, was pulling at a thread in the back of her memory, a thread she couldn't quite find the end of. Not yet. Her driver texted again, "Ma'am, I'm double parked. Should I circle?" Natalie stared at the message. Then she looked at the subway entrance across the street, just a concrete staircase swallowed by rain, and typed back, "Give me 10 minutes." She wasn't sure why she crossed the street. She told herself it was curiosity, the harmless kind, the kind that dissolves the moment you satisfy it. She found him at the bottom of the first landing, just before the turnstiles. He had set his bag on the floor and was trying to zip it one-handed while keeping the baby steady against his shoulder. The formula can wouldn't fit the way he needed it to. He tried twice, jaw tight, saying nothing. "Here." Natalie stepped forward and held the bag open from the bottom without asking. He looked up, startled, clearly not expecting her. "You followed me," he said, not accusatory, just noticing. "I walked in the same direction," she replied without missing a beat. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Almost. He zipped the bag, straightened up. The baby stirred, a small fuss, a curl of pink fingers, and Ethan immediately began a slow, rhythmic sway, barely perceptible, the kind of motion that lives in a parent's body whether they think about it or not. "She have a name?" Natalie asked. "Lily." "How old?" 7 months. He adjusted her again. "She's usually asleep by 8. Tonight's been complicated." Natalie nodded at the formula. "Is she doing okay, health-wise?" "She's perfect," he said. And there it was again, that simple, total certainty. No hesitation, no qualification. Just she's perfect, the way someone says it when they mean it completely. The formula is just, she's gone through more than I expected this week. I miscalculated the budget and grabbed the wrong size can last time. He paused, as if catching himself saying too much to a stranger. "It happens." "It does," Natalie said, though she said it carefully, because the honest truth was that she hadn't miscalculated a budget for anything in years. Not because she was careful, but because the numbers had stopped mattering the way they once did. A train rumbled somewhere below them. The station had that particular nighttime energy, sparse, echoing, everyone in their own world. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said, not unkindly. "You've already done more than enough." "I'm not staying, I'm just standing here." He looked at her with those careful eyes. "In a blazer, in a subway station, at 10 p.m. "I had a meeting in Midtown." "Must have been a big one." "It was," she said. "I don't really know what to do with big wins anymore. So I end up standing in subway stations, apparently." It came out more honest than she intended. She wasn't sure why she'd said it. She never talked like that, not to anyone, certainly not to strangers in damp jackets holding sleeping babies. But it slipped out the way things sometimes do when you're tired enough, when the performance of a long day finally loses its grip. Ethan studied her for a moment. Not judging, more like adjusting his picture of her. "What kind of company?" he asked. "Tech. Infrastructure software mostly. Things most people never know exist, but use every day." She paused. "You?" "Product design." He said it evenly, but something in his shoulders dropped a fraction when he said it. The way people talk about a version of themselves that feels like a previous life. "I was with a firm in Manhattan for 4 years. They let me go in March. Budget cuts. The polite version of, you're good, but you're expensive, and right now we need cheap." "March," she repeated. 7 months ago, right around when Lily would have been born. "My wife left 8 months ago," he said, reading the math in her expression. He wasn't bitter about it, or if he was, he'd buried it somewhere she couldn't see. She wasn't ready for all of this. I don't blame her. He glanced at Lily. Mostly. Natalie said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only response that isn't an insult. "I've had 3 second-round interviews since then," he continued. "None of them went past that. I think the gap in my employment history makes people nervous. Or maybe it's the fact that I ask about flexible hours. That one's probably a red flag for most companies." He almost smiled again. "I'm not exactly what the market wants right now." "The market is frequently wrong," Natalie said. "Maybe." He shifted Lily higher. "But it's the one I have to operate in." Another train, closer this time. A gust of warm tunnel air moved through the station. Lily scrunched her nose without waking. Natalie almost said it then. "I run a company. Send me your portfolio. I'll look at it." She had said versions of that sentence 100 times at charity galas, industry mixers, alumni panels. It came easily, automatically. But something stopped her. She looked at this man, the way he stood, the way he held his daughter, the precise, quiet dignity he'd shown at that pharmacy counter when the cashier turned him away, and she understood instinctively that an offer like that, from a stranger in a subway station who had just handed him formula he didn't ask for, would feel like charity. And charity, to a man like Ethan Cole, wasn't help. It was a wound wearing a ribbon. So she said nothing. And she hated how much sense that made. "I should go," he said, shifting toward the turnstile. He pulled out a worn Metro card, looked at it briefly, a flash of something crossing his face, then tapped it against the reader. It beeped green. He stopped at the other side of the turnstile and looked back at her. "Why'd you really do it?" he asked. "The formula." She considered lying again. It would have been easy. "I don't know yet," she said instead. He held her gaze for a moment, not quite understanding, but not dismissing it either. Then he nodded, that same single nod from the pharmacy counter, and walked toward the platform without looking back. Natalie stood at the turnstile for a long moment, her heels cold against the concrete, the sound of the train pulling away somewhere beneath her. Her driver texted a 3rd time. She didn't read it. Because something was happening in the back of her mind, quiet and insistent, like a door that kept swinging open no matter how many times you closed it. A face, a voice. Not quite his face, not quite his voice. Something older, fuzzier, caught at the edges of a memory she hadn't visited in years. A grocery store, a long line, an empty bank account, and a full basket she couldn't afford. And a stranger who paid, without being asked, without wanting anything back. She pressed her fingers against her temple. No, she thought, that's too strange. That's too much of a coincidence. But the door kept swinging open, and this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to close it. The penthouse was exactly as she had left it. Quiet, expensive, impersonal in the way that well-decorated spaces sometimes are when nobody truly lives in them. when rooms are furnished for the idea of a life rather than the actual one being lived. Natalie dropped her bag near the door, stepped out of her heels without stopping, and walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Brooklyn glittered below her, slick and wet from the rain, every streetlight doubled by its own reflection on the asphalt. Somewhere down there, a man named Ethan Cole was putting his daughter to bed in an apartment she'd never seen, in a life that looked nothing like hers. She poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey she didn't really want and sat on the edge of the couch she never fully relaxed on. It was past midnight.
She had a 7 a.m. call with the Singapore office, a board deck to review, and approximately 0 reasons to still be thinking about a stranger she'd spoken to for 11 minutes in a subway station. And yet, she set the glass down without drinking and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Why'd you really do it? She had told him she didn't know yet. That was the truth. But truth, Natalie had learned, was rarely just 1 layer deep. It was usually a set of stairs going down, and most people stopped at the first landing and called it the bottom. She closed her eyes. And there it was. The door she'd felt swinging open in the subway station, swinging open again. Wider now, harder to ignore in the silence of an apartment where there was nothing else to listen to. She had been 23, 3 years out of the foster system, 4 months into a lease she could barely cover in a shared apartment in Crown Heights with 2 roommates who were never home. She had just started her second job, data entry for a logistics company during the day, waitressing 3 nights a week, and was doing what she privately called the math. The math that poor people do automatically, constantly, the way breathing works. Calculating what she could buy, what she had to delay, what she could eat this week without going into the negative. The grocery store was a Key Food on Nostrand Avenue. It smelled like overripe fruit and floor cleaner. She remembered the fluorescent lights being too bright, the kind of bright that makes everything look a little worse than it is. She had been careful. She had walked every aisle with a running total in her head. A box of pasta, a jar of sauce, a bag of rice, 2 cans of beans, a bunch of bananas going slightly brown, the ones they discount near the end of the week.
She'd been reaching for a small thing of instant coffee when her mental total tipped over what her debit card could handle, and she'd stood there in the aisle doing the math again, 3 times, arriving at the same answer each time. She put the coffee back. At the register, she had placed everything on the belt carefully, methodically, the way you do when you're counting every cent and hoping the cashier doesn't notice. She remembered the sound of the scanner. She remembered the total appearing on the small screen and confirming what she already knew. She had enough. Barely, if she skipped the coffee. And then the man behind her in line had said quietly, almost casually, as if commenting on the weather, "Just put hers in with mine." She had turned around. She never got a clean look at his face. She was flustered, embarrassed, already shaking her head and saying, "No, please, that's okay." And he was looking past her at the cashier, as if the matter were already settled, as if her refusal were just a formality he didn't intend to honor. "It's not a big deal," he said, still calm, still looking at the cashier. She'd remembered the voice more than the face, low and steady, unhurried. The voice of someone who did quiet, unremarkable things without needing them to be noticed. She had turned back to grab her bags, and when she looked back again, there were 2 people between them, and the line had moved, and he was gone. Just like that. Like he hadn't just done something that, to him, cost almost nothing, but to her, standing in that fluorescent-lit store in her second-hand coat with a carefully edited cart, had cost everything. She had cried in the parking lot, not because she was sad, because she was seen, and she hadn't expected it, and she didn't know what to do with it. Natalie opened her eyes. The city glittered outside the window. The whiskey sat untouched. She pressed 2 fingers to her lips and thought about the voice, Ethan's voice in the subway station. "It's not a big deal. She's perfect.
I don't want handouts, just a fair shot. Low and steady and unhurried. The same cadence, the same quality of stillness. She sat up slowly. No. She pressed the thought down firmly. That's not how the world works. You don't randomly collide with the same stranger twice in 13 years in a city of 8 million people. That's a movie. That's the kind of thing that happens when writers need a plot device. She was a woman who had built a company on data, probability, and repeatable systems. She trusted numbers. She trusted patterns. She did not trust the romantic notion that the universe was staging reunions for her personal development.
She picked up her glass, finally drank, and stood. She would go to bed. She would sleep. In the morning, this would shrink back to what it actually was, a brief, forgettable encounter with a stranger who happened to have a steady voice and a good heart. Two qualities that were not as rare as exhausted people like to imagine at midnight. She walked to her bedroom, set her glass on the nightstand, lay down in her expensive sheets, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The door in her memory swung open one more time. The key food on Nostrand Avenue, the fluorescent lights, the sound of the scanner, the voice. Just put hers in with mine. She pulled the blanket up. It wasn't him. It couldn't be him. But the thought that settled in her chest, quietly, stubbornly, like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water, was this. What if it is?
And more unsettling than that, what if you spent 13 years becoming someone worth being helped, and you've been walking past the person who started it all? She didn't sleep for a very long time, and when she finally did, she dreamed of fluorescent lights. She was in the office by 6:45, not because of the Singapore call. That she could have taken from her kitchen in a bathrobe. She came in early because the apartment had started to feel like a room where a thought was loudly pacing, and she needed walls that were used to seeing her in control. Her assistant, Maya, arrived at 7:15 with a green tea and the day's agenda printed on a single sheet, the way Natalie preferred it. Maya was 28, efficient, and had been with her long enough to know that when Natalie said, "I need something handled quietly," it meant without questions, without paper trails, and without anyone else in the office finding out.
"I need you to look someone up," Natalie said, before Maya had set down the tea. She slid a sticky note across the desk. Ethan Cole, product designer, Brooklyn, New York, late 30s. "Professional background?" Maya asked, picking it up without blinking. "Everything. LinkedIn, portfolio, any company affiliations. And run his name through our applicant database." She paused. Quietly. "Of course." Maya turned to leave, then stopped. "Any particular reason we're—" "No," Natalie said. Maya left without another word. The Singapore call lasted 40 minutes. A budget proposal went sideways and had to be restructured on the fly. Natalie handled it calmly, made 3 decisions in under 2 minutes that would affect 17 people on the other side of the world, and hung up feeling nothing in particular. Maya appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later with a folder. "He's real," she said simply, setting it on the desk. Natalie opened it. Ethan James Cole, 34 years old. BFA in Industrial Design from Pratt Institute, class of 2013. 5 years at a firm called Meridian Product Group in Manhattan, where he had worked on consumer tech interfaces, several of which Natalie recognized. Clean portfolio, solid client history. Meridian had let him go in March with a standard severance package and a LinkedIn recommendation that was complimentary in the specific, hollow way companies write them when they don't want lawsuits, but also don't want to make real promises. Nothing in the professional summary was surprising. Nothing in the employment history was suspicious. But then Natalie flipped to the second page. Maya had flagged it in yellow highlighter. Harper Solutions Applicant Database. Match found. Natalie went still. She read it twice. Ethan Cole had applied to Harper Solutions in the spring of 2019, 4 years ago, for a senior product design position. His application had made it to the second round. He had submitted a portfolio, completed a skills assessment, and then nothing. The file showed a standard rejection email had been sent. We've decided to move forward with other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. Standard language. Meaningless language. The kind she had approved for mass use back when she was too busy to think about what it actually felt like to receive it. She remembered 2019. She had been in the middle of acquiring a smaller company and had left most of the hiring decisions to department heads. She had never seen Ethan's name, never seen his portfolio. He had been 40 feet from her office, and she hadn't known. She closed the folder and sat back in her chair. The coincidences were stacking up in a way that no longer felt like coincidence. They felt like something she didn't have a clean, rational word for, which bothered her in a precise and specific way. She opened her laptop. The grocery store memory was the thread she couldn't let go of. She had spent the night trying to dismiss it, but dismissing something and being free of it are two different things entirely. She opened a browser and stared at the blank search bar for a full 30 seconds. Then she typed, Key Food, Nostrand Avenue, Brooklyn. Security footage archive requests. She spent 2 hours going down a path she told herself was probably pointless. She called the Key Food corporate office and was transferred 3 times before reaching a woman in their loss prevention department who told her that security footage from 2010 was unlikely to exist in any retrievable format. Most stores digitally archived only 90 days at the time. Dead end. She almost stopped there. She should have stopped there, but she remembered something. She had used her debit card that night, and her account from back then had been with a community credit union in Brooklyn that she'd closed when she moved offices in 2015. On a long shot, she emailed their member services archive department, explaining she was a former customer trying to retrieve an old transaction record for legal purposes. Then she called in a favor. Her head of cybersecurity, a quiet, meticulous man named Gerald, who owed her professional existence to a recommendation she'd made 6 years ago, had access to data partnerships she preferred not to think about too hard. She gave him the date, the store location, and a time window of roughly 45 minutes, and asked if there was any way to cross-reference point-of-sale logs with nearby camera records that might have been picked up by the city's DOT archival system. She told him it was background research for a potential hire. He didn't push back. He said he'd see what he could find. At 4:17 p.m., Gerald knocked on her office door. He set a printed image on her desk without ceremony. It was grainy, the resolution of a 2010 traffic camera screenshot enlarged past its natural limit. Everything slightly smeared at the edges, the way old digital images go when you push them. It showed the exterior of a building. She could make out the corner of what appeared to be the Key Food awning. The timestamp in the bottom corner read March 14th, 2010, 1943-22. And there, stepping out of the entrance, a plastic grocery bag in one hand, was a figure. Tall, lean, dark jacket. The face was blurred almost beyond recognition. Almost. Because Natalie had spent the previous night memorizing the architecture of a face she'd only seen for 11 minutes. The line of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular way a person holds themselves when they are tired, but still choosing to stand straight. Her hand moved to her mouth. She sat like that for a long moment, not moving, not breathing quite right. It wasn't proof. Legally, professionally, rationally, a grainy traffic camera image and a credit union transaction record was not proof of anything. Any lawyer would laugh at it. Any data scientist would call it a coincidence dressed up as a pattern. But Natalie Harper had not built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars by ignoring the thing her gut was telling her at the end of a long chain of evidence. She knew. She knew the same way she'd known at 23, standing in a parking lot with grocery bags and wet eyes, that the man who had paid for her food without being asked was different from other people. That something about him was worth remembering, even when she couldn't explain why. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there as the afternoon light shifted across her office floor, holding the weight of 13 years folding into a single, impossible, completely real moment. The man she owed everything to was broke, alone, and raising a 7-month-old daughter in Brooklyn. And he had no idea she existed. She spent 2 days talking herself out of it. She made lists, actual physical lists, written in the small leather notebook she kept for decisions that were too important for a screen, of reasons why contacting Ethan Cole again was unnecessary, inappropriate, and professionally impractical. The lists were long. They were logical. They were also completely useless, because the moment she finished writing each one, she turned the page and started thinking about a grainy photograph and a man standing in a subway station, saying, "I just need a fair shot." On the third day, she stopped arguing with herself. She had Maya track down Ethan's email address through his public portfolio website, a clean, spare site she spent an embarrassing amount of time studying the night before she wrote to him. His work was exceptional. She'd expected competent. She got exceptional. Interface designs that were both elegant and intuitive, the kind that felt obvious only after someone had already done the hard work of making them that way. She stared at one project in particular, a healthcare app redesign, for nearly 20 minutes. She wrote the email herself, without Maya's help. She introduced herself as Natalie Harper, CEO of Harper Solutions, and said she'd come across his portfolio through a mutual industry connection, vague enough to be uncheckable. She said she was building a new initiative within her company and was meeting with a handful of designers whose work had caught her attention. She asked if he'd be open to a casual conversation over coffee. It was professional, measured, completely dishonest in its framing, but honest enough in its intent. He replied the next morning, 3 sentences. "Ms. Harper, thank you for reaching out. I'm familiar with Harper Solutions and would be glad to meet. I'm available Thursday afternoon if that works." No exclamation points, no flattery. Just clean, direct sentences from a man who clearly had too many things to manage to waste words. She wrote back, "Thursday at 2. I'll send an address." She chose a cafe in Queens deliberately, neutral ground, far enough from her office that it wouldn't feel like an interview, close enough to his neighborhood that he wouldn't have to travel far with Lily. She arrived 7 minutes early and sat with her back to the wall, the way she always did in unfamiliar spaces, and ordered a black coffee she held with both hands. She had prepared talking points. She had rehearsed transitions. She had done everything except figure out what she actually intended to say. He walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. He looked different in daylight, less worn than he had in the rain, though the tiredness was still there, living just beneath the surface of things. He was dressed simply, a clean navy shirt, dark trousers, no tie. He'd clearly made an effort without making it obvious he had, which she recognized immediately as a particular kind of dignity. He was alone, no Lily. She felt an unexpected flash of disappointment at that, which surprised her. "Ms. Harper." He shook her hand, firm, brief, professional. "Natalie, please." She gestured to the seat across from her. "Thank you for making the trip." "Of course." He sat, declined the menu the server offered, and asked for a water. Then he looked at her directly. No small talk preamble, no warm-up lap. "You mentioned a new initiative. What kind of work are we talking about?" She liked that, the directness. She'd expected him to be more guarded, more deferential, the way people sometimes became in the presence of a title. He wasn't.
We're building out a product design team for a new infrastructure-facing application, she said, slipping into the version of the meeting she'd prepared. The work would require someone who can navigate both functionality and user experience. The kind of person who understands that good design and practical design aren't opposites. They rarely are, he said. Most of the time when they're in conflict, it means someone skipped a step in the research phase. She almost smiled. Exactly. They talked about the work for 20 minutes, and it was the best conversation she'd had in months. He had opinions, grounded, specific, backed by experience, and he didn't soften them to impress her, which made them more impressive. He pushed back gently on one assumption she made about user behavior and was completely right to do it. But underneath the professional rhythm of it, Natalie was watching herself drift from the plan. She had meant to ease into it, mention the role, express interest, offer to fast-track his application, clean, efficient, done. But now, sitting across from him, it felt like a trap she'd built for herself, because every sentence she prepared in that direction sat wrong in her mouth. She set down her coffee.
"I'll be straightforward with you," she said. Something in his posture shifted, a small tightening of attention. "I'd like to bring you in. Your portfolio is genuinely strong, and the gap in your employment history doesn't concern me." She kept her voice neutral, professional. "I can have an offer letter drafted within the week. There'd be no formal interview process. I'm prepared to move directly to—" "Why?" he said. Just that. Quiet and immediate. "Because your work speaks for—" "No one skips the process," he said, not unkindly.
But firmly. Not at a company like yours. Not for a senior-level role. He looked at her steadily. "We met 4 days ago in a subway station. You bought formula for my daughter, and now you're offering me a job with no interview?" He paused. "I'm not ungrateful, but I'd like to understand what's actually happening here." The silence between them was uncomfortably honest. Natalie was good at many things. She was not, it turned out, good at lying to someone who was paying close enough attention to catch her. She chose her words carefully. "I believe in your work. That part is entirely true." "I believe you," he said. "But there's a difference between believing in someone's work and bypassing every professional system to hand them something." He leaned forward slightly. "I've spent 7 months applying to places that won't give me a real look because of a gap on paper. I don't want the version of a job that comes because someone felt sorry for me." He said it without heat, without self-pity, just clearly, the way a person speaks when they've thought something through completely. "I don't want handouts. I just need a fair shot." There it was, the exact sentence she had known, in some part of herself, was coming, and she had no answer for it. Not one that didn't require telling him something she wasn't ready to tell him. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay?" "A fair shot," she repeated. "I can give you that. A real process, no shortcuts, no special treatment." She held his gaze. "But I'll be honest, I don't think you need much of a shot. Your work is that good." Something in him settled. Not pride, more like relief. The specific relief of being seen correctly rather than being helped incorrectly. "That's all I'm asking for," he said. They finished their coffees talking about a product case study he'd worked on at Meridian, and for a few minutes it felt almost ordinary. 2 people talking about work in an afternoon cafe in Queens. But Natalie's mind was already 3 moves ahead, building a structure that could give Ethan exactly what he'd asked for, without him ever knowing she'd built it for him. And somewhere beneath that, a quieter thought. She had come here to repay a debt. She was leaving with something closer to admiration, which was, she was beginning to understand,
far more complicated than debt.
She told herself it was research. That was the word she used. Internally, privately, in the running commentary she kept in her own head, the way busy people do when they need to justify things to themselves quickly and move on. Research. The word made it feel systematic, purposeful, like something a reasonable, grounded CEO might do before designing a program intended to help overlooked professionals re-enter the workforce. She was already building the program in her mind. She needed to understand what the gap actually looked like from the inside. That was all. She went on a Saturday. The park was 3 blocks from the address Maya had quietly pulled from Ethan's portfolio contact details. It was a wide, unhurried place, the kind of Brooklyn park that feels like a held breath between 2 noisy streets.
Old trees, benches with peeling green paint, a sandbox area surrounded by low wooden beams where parents sat in a loose cluster, watching children with the half-present attention that experienced parents develop. Alert enough to move fast, relaxed enough not to hover. Natalie sat on a bench near the far edge with a coffee and her phone, dressed deliberately plainly, dark jeans, a gray coat, no jewelry. She felt slightly ridiculous and then immediately reminded herself she had flown to Singapore in economy class once to better understand her logistics partner's cost structures. She was capable of sitting on a park bench. She saw him within 10 minutes. He came through the east entrance pushing a second-hand stroller, the sturdy, no-frills kind, with a canvas bag hanging from one handle. Lily was awake this time, upright in the seat, wearing a yellow knit hat with a small pom-pom on top, studying the world around her with the grave, total concentration of someone encountering it fresh.
Natalie had called ahead and arranged a brief meeting with the director under the banner of Harper Solutions' community investment arm, which was real enough. They ran a modest annual grant program for early childhood education providers in the borough. The director, a warm, unhurried woman named Patricia, met her in a small office that smelled like crayons and hand sanitizer. They talked about the grant program for 20 minutes. Patricia was grateful, specific, and precise about what the funding actually enabled. She was the kind of person who knew exactly where every dollar went, which Natalie respected enormously. Then, carefully, she mentioned that she was developing a new professional re-entry program and was doing background research on the kinds of family pressures that made it difficult for skilled workers to stay in the workforce.
Patricia nodded slowly. I could tell you stories all day. I imagine, Natalie said. Do many of your families include single parents who've had to step back from careers? More than you'd think. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. We have one father, I won't say who, of course, been bringing his daughter here since she was 3 months old. Brilliant man. Used to work in design, I believe. Lost his position, and instead of abandoning his daughter, he restructured his entire life around her. She shook her head gently. He comes in every morning. He's warm with the staff. He asks good questions about her development. He's the kind of parent we'd want every child to have. A pause. He's also clearly exhausted and too proud to say so. Natalie said nothing. She kept her expression professionally neutral. The system isn't built for people like him, Patricia continued. He has a skills gap on paper because he spent 7 months being a full-time parent, which is the hardest job in the world, and companies look at that gap and see a liability. It's backwards. She looked at Natalie with the direct, unimpressed gaze of someone who had spent decades watching institutions fail families. If your program is real and not just optics, and I hope it is, people like him are exactly who it should be built for. It's real, Natalie said quietly. She meant it more than she had meant almost anything in recent memory. She drove home through evening traffic, the city shifting from gold to gray around her, and thought about what she had spent 2 decades building. Harper Solutions existed because a girl with nothing had clawed her way forward 1 year at a time, convinced that if she could just get inside the room, she could prove herself. She had gotten inside the room. She had proved herself over and over, until the room got bigger and bigger, and eventually she owned it. But she had never once looked back at the door and thought about who was still standing outside it. Not really. Not specifically. Not with a name and a face and a pom-pom hat and a 7-month-old daughter who smiled like the world was new. The program she was designing had started, in her mind, as a mechanism, a clean, defensible structure that could give Ethan an opportunity without injuring his pride. A way to repay something unpayable without making it look like repayment. But somewhere between the park bench and Patricia's office, it had become something else. She thought about the other Ethans, the ones she'd never met. The product designers and engineers and architects and writers who had taken 6 months off to care for a sick parent or a newborn, and come back to find the door had closed quietly while they were gone. The ones the market had decided were too complicated, too gapped, too expensive to be worth the risk. She had been one of them once. She had just been lucky enough to have someone remind her, briefly, accidentally, in a fluorescent-lit grocery store, that strangers could still surprise you. She picked up her phone at the next red light and called her head of operations. "Clear my Tuesday morning," she said. "I need 3 hours with the board." "Anything I should prep them for?" She looked out at the city moving past her window. All those lit windows. All those lives stacked on top of each other. "Tell them we're building something new," she said. "Something we should have built a long time ago." She hung up, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the hollow feeling that usually followed a decision was absent. In its place was something she'd almost forgotten the weight of. It felt like purpose. The boardroom on the 32nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over lower Manhattan, and on clear mornings the light came in at an angle that made everything look more important than it probably was. Natalie had always suspected that was intentional, that whoever designed the room understood that good light makes people feel like their decisions matter. She was going to need that this morning. She arrived before anyone else, set her laptop at the head of the table, and pulled up a deck she had spent 4 nights building. Not Maya, not the strategy team. Her. Alone, at her kitchen counter past midnight, with cold coffee and a legal pad covered in crossed-out versions of the same idea, until she found the one that was honest enough to believe in and practical enough to defend. The board filed in at 9 sharp. 6 people. 2 venture partners, a former tech executive, a finance director, and 2 independent members who tended to vote together and ask questions designed to sound like concerns, but were really just permission slips to agree. Natalie had presented to this group for 4 years. She knew their rhythms, their thresholds, their specific and individual fears. She had built this deck accordingly. "I want to propose a new internal program," she began without preamble. "We're calling it the Elevate Incubator. The premise is simple. We identify high-skill professionals who have been systematically overlooked by the market. Employment gaps, non-traditional backgrounds, people who were good enough to get to the second round everywhere and never got past it. And we bring them into a structured 6-month program. Real projects, real output, real compensation. At the end, the strongest candidates convert to full-time roles." She clicked to the first slide. The silence in the room had a specific texture, the kind that isn't empty, but loaded. David Hartwell, the finance director, spoke first. He always spoke first. "What's the cost model?" She had the numbers ready. She walked through them cleanly. Program budget, compensation structure, projected conversion rate, estimated cost per hire compared against their current agency and recruiter fees. On paper, if even 40% of incubator participants converted to full-time roles, The company would spend less per successful hire than they currently did through traditional channels.
"It's not cheaper in the short term," she said, before anyone could use that against her. "It costs more up front, but it builds a talent pipeline we own. It reduces our dependency on a recruiting market that frankly isn't delivering the profiles we need. And it generates a category of institutional loyalty you simply cannot buy from someone who came in through a standard job posting." "It sounds like a charity program dressed in a business suit," said Richard Ewan, one of the venture partners. He said it pleasantly, which made it harder to push back against. "It sounds like that," Natalie agreed, "which is exactly why I didn't frame it that way to you just now. I framed it as an innovation strategy, because that's what it is." She clicked forward 2 slides to a data page she'd built from publicly available research on talent acquisition gaps in the tech sector. The most underutilized talent pool in this industry isn't junior candidates. It's experienced professionals in their 30s who took career interruptions for family, health, or circumstances outside their control. They have the skills. They don't have the clean resume. We're leaving extraordinary people on the table because our filters were designed to protect us from risk, not to find us value. Another silence. Different texture this time. Margaret Osei, the former tech executive and the only other woman in the room, leaned forward slightly. "How do you select participants?" "Blind skills assessment, portfolio review, and a structured interview process run by department leads, not HR alone. No names attached to submissions until after the scoring round." Natalie met her eyes. "Same process we'd use for any senior hire. Stricter, actually." Margaret nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something. "I want to run a pilot," Natalie continued. "1 cohort, 12 participants, 6 months. We measure output quality, team integration, and conversion outcomes. If the numbers don't support expansion, we close it, and I absorb the cost from my discretionary budget." She looked around the table. "I'm not asking you to believe in the idea yet. I'm asking you to let the data make the argument." It took 40 minutes of questions, some sharp, some reflexive, most answerable. Richard pushed back twice more. David ran the numbers again out loud, which meant he was already calculating how to support it. Margaret said very little after her initial question, which, in Natalie's experience, meant she was already decided. The vote was 4-2 in favor of the pilot. Natalie thanked them, closed her laptop, and walked out of the boardroom at 10:23 a.m., feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time after a business win. She felt like it mattered. The Elevate Incubator posted publicly 3 weeks later. Natalie had been careful, obsessively, almost anxiously careful, to ensure that nothing about the program's design pointed toward any individual. The criteria were broad enough to be legitimate, specific enough to be defensible, and structured in a way that meant the process would surface genuine talent regardless of who applied. She did not contact Ethan. She told herself this repeatedly, like a rule she was enforcing on herself. You do not contact him. You do not send him the link. You do not ask Maya to forward it anonymously. You built a door. You do not drag him through it. She refreshed the applicant portal more times than she would ever admit to anyone. On the 9th day of the application window, his name appeared in the system. Ethan James Cole, Senior Product Designer, Brooklyn, New York. She saw the notification on her phone at 6 a.m. while still in bed, and sat up so quickly she knocked her water glass off the nightstand. She did not open his application. She forwarded it to the assessment team with a header that read, "All incubator applications to be processed without executive review. Blind scoring protocol applies." Then she set her phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a while. He had found it on his own, applied on his own, which meant the program had done what she'd told the board it would do. It had reached people who deserved a look and hadn't been getting one. That part, at least,
was clean. What followed was 3 weeks of the most uncomfortable professional patience Natalie had ever practiced. She received aggregated scoring updates, no names, just candidate numbers, and watched a cohort take shape from anonymized data. Strong portfolios, she was told, competitive assessment scores across the board. The final interview results landed on a Tuesday. 12 participants selected for the inaugural Elevate cohort. She scrolled the list slowly. Candidate number 7, Ethan Cole. He had scored highest in the portfolio evaluation and second overall in the structured interview round. The department lead's notes read, "Exceptional systems thinking, communicates design rationale with unusual clarity, instinctively user-centered, strong hire." Natalie read the notes twice. Then she did something she almost never did in the office. She closed her door, sat down in her chair, and let herself feel it. The specific, uncomplicated joy of watching someone get exactly what they deserved. Not because she had given it to them, because she had simply made sure the floor was level enough for them to stand on. There was a difference. She needed there to be a difference. And tonight, for the first time, she almost believed there was. 3 weeks into the incubator, Natalie started running into Ethan the way you run into someone when your building is only so large, and you are both, it turns out, early risers. The first time was at the elevator bank at 7:15 a.m. He had a coffee and a folder and didn't seem surprised to see her, which surprised her. He said good morning the way people do when they mean it and not just as a formality, and she said it back, and they rode 11 floors together in a silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. The second time was in the small kitchen on the 24th floor, where she'd gone specifically because it was rarely used by anyone whose meetings she'd have to manage afterward. He was there reading something on his phone, leaning against the counter. He looked up, and something passed between them, a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with the incubator or the program or any professional context. Just two people who had stood in a subway station in the rain and told each other small, real things. "How's Lily?" she asked, pouring coffee. "Sleeping better," he said. "Finally." And the relief in those two words was the most human thing she'd heard in weeks. The third time, she stopped pretending it was accidental. She sent him a message through the internal system on a Thursday evening when the office had mostly emptied out. "Would you have 10 minutes? Rooftop. It's not about the program." He replied within 5 minutes. "I'll be there." The rooftop was a narrow terrace on the 34th floor that most employees didn't know existed. There were 2 wooden benches, a cluster of potted grasses that had survived 3 New York winters, and a view of the city that on clear evenings looked almost forgiving. All that density and noise softened by distance and the slow gold of the setting sun. Ethan was already there when she pushed through the door. He was standing at the railing, looking out. He turned when he heard her, and she noticed he'd come straight from his desk, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the same focused quietness he carried everywhere. "You said it wasn't about the program," he said. "It's not." She walked to the railing and stood beside him, not quite looking at him yet. The city spread out below them, unhurried and indifferent. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 6 weeks. I haven't found a version that sounds right, so I'm going to say it plainly and ask you to stay with it for a minute before you respond." He said nothing, just waited. 13 years ago, she began, I was broke. Genuinely, completely broke. Not the kind people romanticize, the kind where you're doing math in your head every hour of every day and the numbers never come out the way you need them to. She kept her eyes on the skyline. I was in a grocery store in Crown Heights, Key Food on Nostrand Avenue, a Friday night in March. She paused. My cart was small. I had calculated it to the cent, and a man standing behind me in line told the cashier to put my groceries in with his. Just like that, without asking, without making it a moment. She finally turned to look at him. I never saw his face clearly. I never got his name. I cried in the parking lot, and I never forgot it. Ethan's expression had shifted, a careful, searching look, like a man trying to find his footing on ground that has unexpectedly changed beneath him.
"I've spent the last 6 weeks confirming what I suspected the night I met you," she said. "The timestamp, the location, an image from a traffic camera that isn't exactly clear but is clear enough." She held his gaze. "It was you, Ethan." The silence on the rooftop was different from any silence that had come before it in this story. It had weight and texture. The city below them continued its indifferent hum. Ethan looked away, looked back. His jaw moved once before he spoke. "Crown Heights," he said slowly. "Key food." He was quiet for a long moment. "I used to walk through that neighborhood on Fridays. My mother lived 3 blocks from there before she moved upstate." He exhaled, a long, slow breath. I can't say I remember the specific night. I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you I do." She shook her head. "That's not why I'm telling you." "Then why?" She had rehearsed this part the least because it was the part she trusted herself with least. "Because that moment, which meant nothing to you, which was just a reflex, just Tuesday for someone like you, changed the direction of my life." She said it simply, without performance. I had been operating on a specific set of beliefs about the world, that people looked out for themselves, that kindness was transactional, that no one did something for nothing. She almost smiled, but it came out smaller than a smile. "You cost me those beliefs in about 30 seconds. And what I built in their place is everything. This company, the way I hire, the way I lead, the way I stood in a pharmacy 3 weeks ago and bought formula for a man I didn't know." She stopped. "That was you too. 13 years later. And somehow I still almost missed it." Ethan was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully name. Something between astonishment and something quieter and older. "The incubator," he said. Not a question. The understanding arriving in real time. "Yes," she said. "Though I want to be clear. Your scores stand on their own. I have the evaluations. I didn't touch the process." "I know," he said, and she believed him. Then, after a moment, "How much of it was for me?" The most honest question she'd been asked in years. "The program was real before you applied," she said. "It would have existed without you, but would I have built it when I did, the way I did, if I hadn't met you in that subway station?" She looked at him steadily. "I don't think so." He turned back to the railing, looked at the city for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I grew up with very little. My mother worked 2 jobs and still came up short most months. I watched her accept help from people and watched how some of them made her feel small for needing it." He paused. "I decided early on that if I ever had anything to spare, even just a few dollars in a grocery line, I would give it the way I wished people had given to her. Like it was nothing. Like it didn't require gratitude." Natalie felt something in her chest break open very quietly. "To me," he said, "it was just the right thing to do." She had expected those words. She had imagined him saying something close to them, but hearing them, here, in his actual voice, with the city behind him and the evening light catching the exhaustion and the steadiness of his face equally, was entirely different from imagining them. "I know," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "That's what made it matter." He looked at her then, really looked at her,
and she understood that something had shifted in the way he saw her. Not the CEO now, not the woman who bought formula or built programs or tracked down blurry photographs. Just a person. Someone who had been young and broke and seen, and who had carried that seeing for 13 years and built a life from it. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." "Thank you," she said, "for not making me feel foolish for having to." The sun was going down over New Jersey, painting the water copper and gray. Neither of them moved for a while.
And in the long, unguarded quiet that followed, no titles between them, no debt, no program, no history requiring anything. Something new settled in the space where all of that had been. Not resolved, not finished, just honest. Which, Natalie was beginning to understand, was the only foundation anything real was ever built on. 5 months passed the way good months do, quickly, and with the specific texture of time that is actually being used. The Elevate cohort settled into the company the way new things sometimes do when they're genuinely right, with some friction at the edges and something solid forming at the center. 3 participants left after the first month, 1 by choice, 2 by mutual agreement. The remaining 9 became, within weeks, some of the most referenced voices in their respective departments. The department heads who had been skeptical in the beginning stopped being skeptical, which was the only kind of conversion Natalie had ever trusted.
Ethan led a product team that no one had officially assigned him to lead. It had happened the way real leadership always happens, quietly, organically, and then suddenly, it was simply the state of things, and nobody could quite remember when it had shifted. He was working on an interface overhaul for one of Harper Solutions' mid-tier infrastructure products, a platform used by logistics companies across 11 states that had been functionally reliable and visually prehistoric for 4 years. His team called it Project Meridian, with a dry self-awareness about his previous employer that Natalie appreciated when she heard about it secondhand. She had kept her distance, not coldly. They still spoke when paths crossed, still exchanged the kind of morning greetings that carry actual warmth. But she had been deliberate about not hovering. She had built the room. She had no interest in standing in the doorway watching him work. The product launch was scheduled for a Thursday evening in March. Natalie knew this because it was on the company calendar, not because she had arranged it. She cleared her evening, which she almost never did for internal events, and told Maya not to schedule anything before 10 the next morning, which was either professional interest or something else she hadn't fully named yet. The venue was the company's main event space on the 28th floor, a large glass-walled room they used for client presentations and the annual all-hands. Someone had arranged low lighting and moved the furniture, which transformed it in that particular way that transforms ordinary rooms into occasions. Natalie arrived at 7 and stood near the back. The room was fuller than she'd expected, not just incubator staff and department heads, but logistics clients who had been using the old platform for years. There was an energy in the room she recognized, the specific electricity of people who have come expecting competence and are quietly bracing for the possibility of being genuinely impressed. Ethan stood at the front near a large display screen, unhurried, talking to 2 clients with the focused ease of someone who has stopped performing confidence because they no longer need to. He was dressed well, dark jacket, no tie, and Lily's photograph was not on the slide deck, but it was, in some way that Natalie couldn't articulate, present in every decision he'd made in the past 5 months. He hadn't seen her yet. She preferred it that way. When the presentation began, she watched from the back of the room with her arms loosely folded and her expression professionally neutral, which was a configuration that cost her more effort tonight than usual. Because what Ethan Cole had built was extraordinary, not in the way of things that announce themselves loudly, not flashy, not showy, not the kind of design that makes people applaud the designer rather than use the thing.
It was extraordinary in the deeper way, the quieter way. It solved every real problem the old platform had created. It anticipated the ones users hadn't yet articulated, and it did all of this while looking so intuitive that you couldn't imagine it having been any other way. Which was, she knew, the highest possible achievement in product design and the one that left the least evidence of its own effort. The clients asked questions for 40 minutes. Ethan answered every one without deflecting, without overselling, and without once glancing at his notes.
At the end, an operations director from a logistics firm in Ohio said, with the blunt sincerity of someone who didn't attend many events and wasn't interested in being polite for politeness' sake, "This is the first platform redesign in 20 years that I'd actually want my team to use." The room laughed. Ethan smiled. The real one, the one she'd first seen almost by accident in a subway station. The one that seemed to surprise even him slightly when it arrived. Natalie stayed at the back and felt something she recognized only after a moment as pride. Not the proprietary kind, not, "I made this happen." The other kind, the kind that has nothing to do with ownership. She slipped out before the formal applause finished. She was on the rooftop when he found her. She hadn't planned it. She just needed air, and the rooftop was where she went when the 32nd floor felt too managed. She was standing at the railing with her jacket pulled close, looking at the city, when she heard the door open behind her. "Someone said they saw you come up here," Ethan said. "Someone should mind their own business," she said without turning around. He came to stand beside her. Below them, the city did what it always did. Moved, hummed, continued, indifferent and magnificent. "It was a good night," she said. "It was," he said simply. And then, after a pause, "Thank you for being there." "I was there as an attendee. The work was yours." "I know." He said it without false modesty, which she respected. "I mean, thank you for being there." She understood the distinction. She nodded once. They stood in the cold for a while, not filling the silence with things it didn't need. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and said, "I have to warn you, this is about to make the evening significantly less professional." She turned. He was holding his phone, screen facing her. On it was a video. Lily, 10 months old now, sitting upright on a blanket with the unsteady, determined posture of someone who has recently discovered she has a spine and is very serious about using it. She was holding a soft toy in both hands, examining it with the focused intensity of a scientist. And then she looked directly at the camera and produced a laugh so sudden and complete that it seemed to surprise even her. Natalie looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not her professional laugh, not the warm but measured sound she produced at events. A real one. Unguarded and sudden, startling in the cold night air. "She's incredible," she said when she'd recovered. "She is," Ethan said. The simple, total certainty. Still exactly the same. He put his phone away and looked at the city. "She's with my mother tonight. First time I've left her that long." He paused. "It was hard to leave. It was also... I needed tonight to be mine, in a way I could own completely. Does that make sense?" "More than almost anything you've ever said to me," Natalie said. He turned to look at her then, fully, the way he had on this same rooftop 5 months ago when she had told him the truth about a grocery store and a Friday night in March. And she understood that he was seeing her the same way she was seeing him, not as a title, not as a history, not as a debt or a miracle or a coincidence. Just a person, complicated and capable and still figuring things out. "She asks about you, you know," he said. Natalie blinked. "She's 10 months old." "She points at the door when I come home," he said, and there was something in his voice, gentle,
careful, as if he was offering something without insisting it be taken. "I've started telling her your name." Something moved through Natalie's chest that she didn't have a precise word for. Not love, or not only love, not yet, but the feeling that arrives just before love, when you realize you've already made room for someone without meaning to. "Tell her," Natalie said after a moment, "that the door goes both ways." Ethan looked at her steadily. He nodded. The same single nod from the pharmacy counter, from the subway station, from every moment he'd chosen quiet dignity over everything louder and easier. Only this time, it meant something different. This time, it meant yes. The city hummed below them, vast and cold and completely uninterested in what was happening on a rooftop on the 34th floor, where two people who had met in a pharmacy in the rain were standing at the edge of something neither of them had planned, and both of them had, in their own quiet ways, been walking toward for 13 years. One small act of kindness, no expectation, no audience, no score being kept, and everything, absolutely everything, that had grown from it.